First, we go to the Veterans Memorial Courthouse in Lansing, Michigan, for the trial of 35-year-old Joshua Harding, who's been charged with 2 counts of sexual assault. There's Harding. 2 prosecutors represent the state, including Jonathan Roth, who, prior to sentencing, asked the court to consider a sentence on the higher end of the guidelines. At the far end of the table is Detective Brian Kanan, the lead investigator in the case against Harding. The jury's reached a decision in one of the cases and is about to read its verdict. In under 8 seconds, so much has happened. Let's look at it again. If you look a little closer, you can see Harding remove something from inside his sleeve. Turns out Harding is holding a metal shank. Harding storms the prosecutor's table, headed straight for Assistant DA Roth. If not for the quick reflexes of Detective Kanan, Roth could have sustained serious injuries. 2 court deputies immediately take action to help bring Harding, who stands 6'6" and weighs 280, to the ground. Watch as Roth removes his glasses to take a step towards the scrum. A spectator points something out to Roth. It's the shank. Meanwhile, Kanan and the 2 bailiffs are still wrestling with Harding. It took about 30 seconds to eventually cuff and remove the defendant from the courtroom. This brazen attack brought Harding an additional charge of assault with intent to murder, to which he pled guilty. As for the original charges, Harding was found guilty of second-degree criminal sexual conduct and is now serving a combined sentence of 44 years at a state prison. The earliest he could be released is the year 2064. Authorities are unsure how Harding got the weapon into the courthouse. Because Harding was in police custody during the trial, he did not have to pass through a metal detector upon entering the courthouse. He also was not required to wear handcuffs. We're in the Miami-Dade Bond Court.
Good afternoon. I'm Judge Mindy Glazer. I'll be presiding today over the bond hearings.
Today, she'll see dozens of defendants.
You were arrested for retail theft, and I'll appoint the public defender for you.
But one in particular is sure to stand out. The defendant is Sherry Lynn, who's facing charges of felony battery and resisting arrest with violence. Lynn appears remotely and is represented by a public defender. And from the very first question...
Have you ever been treated for any mental health issues?
Why don't you yourself first?
It's clear Lynn is in no mood to be in court.
I'm sorry, ma'am?
I said go yourself.
Okay, well, I'm a little busy right now.
Take another look.
I said go yourself.
Judge Glazer initially finds the behavior amusing, but she's not about to let it continue.
Ma'am, I'm just trying to help.
Ma'am, he's trying to help you. And please don't use profanity or try and disrupt my courtroom, because I don't want to be forced to hold you in contempt of court. Mr. Snyder's trying to help you. And I'm ordering that you stay away from Cynthia Cuba. Do not have any contact with her. You must stay away from her home and place of business. As to the other case...
Who is this Cynthia Cuba? Tell me.
I think you allegedly tried to hit with the pliers. The other case, F-51-426, the bond on is $5,000. It's $5,000, and count 3 is $1,000. Have a nice day, ma'am. Let's try and get you into the hospital.
Lynn's ordered to pay a $50 fine and undergo a psychiatric evaluation.
My name is James Casey, and I remember I was looking up at him, and he kept saying, Casey, Casey, and I remember he told me that I had been shot.
Our next stop is inside the holding facility of the Chandler Municipal Court in Chandler, Arizona. Detention officers have come to remove 23-year-old Kevin Lyons to bring him before a judge. Lyons had been arrested in Chandler on a warrant for driving under the influence. It's also important to note that Lyons is handcuffed in the front. In court documents, he later claimed officers offered to remove the cuffs, but he refused, stating he kept them on for a reason. When the male officer tries to nudge him along, he chooses not to cooperate. The 2 officers try to subdue Lyons. he refuses to let up. Lyons loses a boot, but continues fighting and kicking. And he lands a shot that knocks the female officer back. And now, if you watch closely, this is where the handcuffs and Lyons' reason for keeping them on come into play. If you look at it again, you can see Lyons manages to slip his cuffs around the male officer's neck, putting him in a potentially deadly stranglehold. It's been over 20 seconds and time is running out. But the officer continues to fight. Eventually, he manages to slip out of Lyons' grip and turn the tables. While escaping from Lyons' chokehold, the male officer suffered a cut to his face and on the back of his ear. A third officer enters to assist, and they begin the very careful process of repositioning Lyons' cuffs behind his back.
Because here's what's going to happen next. Okay. Tell me. You're going to go to the hospital if you resist any, okay?
I know. I already know.
Okay.
I've done it before. You know, Mama. You see my record.
No, I haven't.
Well, I hope you don't see it.
Court documents show Lyons was previously convicted of assaulting officers. So this time, they make absolutely sure they've secured the cuffs behind his back.
They're double. Right here. We're good.
Lyons may be contained, but that doesn't mean he's going to go quietly.
Okay. You know me. That's what it is.
Lyons is led back to his cell, where he continues to mouth off the male officer.
Okay. That's messed up. That's all. I didn't do too yet. Once I grabbed my wrist and started meeting me recording, everything on cash in.
Lyons is booked into Maricopa County Jail and now faces 2 additional aggravated assault charges against a correction officer. Our next stop is the Warren County Common Pleas Court in Lebanon, Ohio, for a case that riveted many around the nation. Today, all eyes are focused on this packed courtroom, because in just a few moments, a jury will decide the fate of Brooke Skylar Richardson, a young mother accused of killing her newborn baby. Just 2 years earlier, the then 18-year-old high school senior gave birth to a little girl at home one night and didn't tell anyone. She managed to keep her pregnancy a secret because she suffered from an eating disorder and only gained 15 pounds. And Richardson apparently wasn't sure the baby, whom she named Annabelle, was alive at birth. So she took the body into the backyard and buried her. 2 months later, Richardson's OBGYN told police she confessed to him that she killed the baby. Authorities dug up the remains of Annabelle, and the high school cheerleader is hauled in for questioning by police.
Is it possible that she maybe breathed a little bit? Maybe. Okay. Okay. I never tell. Okay. You know what? I think I held her too tight. You said I think maybe I held her too tight. Tell me what that means. I just think she was breathing. I think I squeezed her too hard. Okay. But it was I know. It's okay. It's okay. You can't. It's okay. You were trying. I think I'm going to kill her. Okay. Okay. I think I killed her. I think I killed her on purpose. I'm going to go to jail.
In a moment that will change her life forever, she seemingly confesses to detectives. Richardson's arrested and charged with a number of counts, including aggravated murder and involuntary manslaughter. It's a sensational trial that made headlines across the country. On social media, Richardson and her family were vilified. They even received death threats. Finally, more than 2 years after that tragic night, Brooke Skylar Richardson is about to learn her fate.
Ma'am, has the jury reached a verdict in the case?
We have.
If she's found guilty, she could go to prison for the rest of her life.
I firmly believe, Ms. Richardson, if you would have made different decisions, Annabelle would be here today.
We're back in Lebanon, Ohio, and a jury's about to determine the fate of Brooke Schuyler Richardson, accused of killing her newborn baby.
Would the defendant please rise? With regard to count one, we, the jury in the above captioned case, find the defendant, Brooke Schuyler Richardson, not guilty of the offense of aggravated murder, not guilty of the offense of involuntary manslaughter. Count three, child endangerment. We, the jury, find the defendant, Brooke Schuyler Richardson, not guilty of child endangerment. Verdict form number 4, we, the jury in the above captioned case, find the defendant, Brooke Schuyler Richardson, guilty of the offense of abuse of a corpse. Ladies and gentlemen, are those the verdicts of the jury?
Yes, sir.
You may be seated.
Richardson is only found guilty on one lesser count.
I'm going to set this matter for sentencing tomorrow at 11 o'clock.
But the next day, before she's sentenced, Judge Donald Oda takes a moment to remind everyone that despite the verdict, a life was lost.
The jury found that the state did not prove that you were guilty of killing your baby, but I think what often gets overlooked, Ms. Richardson, is just how precious life is. I firmly believe, Ms. Richardson, in fact, I know in my heart that if you would have made different decisions in this case, Annabelle would be here today. And I know that might be difficult for you to hear, but I think that your choices before birth, during birth, and after show a grotesque disregard for life.
And with that, Judge Oda informs Richardson of her sentence.
I'm going to place you on 3 years of basic supervision. I'm going to order as a term of your community control that you spend 7 days in the county jail. I'm going to credit you the 7 days that you have already done, which means that you are going to be going home today.
Richardson's long ordeal finally concludes with her being placed on 3 years probation. We take you to Dover, New Hampshire, where Christopher Elwell was just sentenced for sexually assaulting a 4-year-old girl. This was Elwell's second conviction for molesting a child.
They described him showing videos of sexual acts similar to the ones that she had done.
At first, Elwell denied the attack, but would eventually admit it to the court.
To that charge, how do you plead, guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
His sentence? 7.5 to 15 years in prison. He heads towards the back of the court to sit and wait, as there are other cases on the docket today. The man who just delivered that blow is Josiah Davies, who is awaiting arraignment on a probation violation. Davies heard every lurid detail from Elwell's case and decided to send a message. Since both men are shackled, Davies used the only weapon available. The two defendants had no prior history, and Elwell suffered no serious injuries in the attack. Davies, however, pled guilty to assaulting a prisoner and, on an unrelated offense, pled guilty to forgery. He was sentenced to 3.5 to 7 years in prison. The earliest Elwell can be released is October 2024.
I was just staring at the ground, and I was just putting people's heads, their pictures in my head. I said, "You're my wife." I was like, if I go down and go out, I'm dead.
We now head over to Maricopa County Superior Court in Phoenix, Arizona, for the murder trial of alleged gang member Ramon Bueno.
Swear the testimony you're about to give truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help you God.
Yes, I do.
Bueno's charged with 3 counts of aggravated assault, along with the attempted murder of a police officer. The officer?
James, could you introduce yourself to the jury?
Good afternoon. My name is James Casey. I'm a retired Arizona Department of Public Safety state trooper.
14, is that right?
Casey, just 5 years earlier, pulled over Bueno and some friends for heavily tinted windows, a violation in Arizona, when Bueno allegedly pulled out a gun and shot Casey in the face.
I want you to tell us about what happened that night, how we got to where we are today.
I said, "Your social security number." I said, "I have your social security number. I'll run you that way." And so he said 6. And then he said, when he said 6, I started to lean in because it sounded like he was giving me something. And he said 0. And I heard 0. And the next thing I heard was an explosion.
Tell us what you remember happening next.
I remember Ray, our Trooper Cruz, Ray, I saw him. I remember him straddling me, and I remember I was looking up at him, and he kept saying, Casey, Casey. He's like, you okay, you okay? And I remember he told me that I had been shot. And I was making a mental note, so what I was doing is, I was just staring at the ground, and I was just putting people's heads, their pictures in my head. I was thinking my wife, I was saying their name, my mom, and I was saying Mom. I'd see a picture of my dad, I'd say Dad, my brother, I'd say Tim, you know. I was just trying not to, I was just trying to think. I was like, if I go down and go out, I'm dead. I will never wake up.
The following pictures you're about to see are graphic. It'll be hard to look at for some viewers. Trooper Casey tells the jury how he suffered through a total of 17 surgeries and medical procedures, including having his nose and parts of his face reconstructed, and how he has to live the rest of his life with bullet fragments in his head.
And good afternoon, Mr. Bueno.
Good afternoon.
We do have verdicts. We'll bring in the jury, please.
All rise for the jury.
At the conclusion of the trial, jurors deadlocked on the attempted murder charge, but Ramon Bueno is found guilty of 7 of the 8 remaining charges and sentenced to over 85 years in prison. Joining us now is Trooper James Casey. Trooper James Casey, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. What was it like for you to have to relive that moment again in such detail?
You know, that's a good question, and I have to tell you, as I've said to others before, when Trooper Ray Cruz got up there and testified, and he was talking about having to basically take pieces of my mouth, my bones, my teeth out of my throat so I could start breathing. I had never heard that before. And I was basically doing, as I call it, the death rattle. I was just basically drowning in my own blood. That's stuff I'd never heard before. So it was tough to listen to.
Were you angry? Were you frustrated?
I would say a little bit of everything. You know, I was angry that, I mean, he's afflicted me with lifelong conditions, and then just, mad it took so long. I mean, 5 years is a long time.
How'd you feel when the verdict came in?
Well, the hung jury on my attempted murder, I was shocked, but the shooting, the aggravated assault on law enforcement, I was happy for.
By all accounts, it is a miracle that you are here today. But is it fair to say that you are not fully recovered?
No, I don't think I ever will be. Since I've been back, I've had 2 mini strokes. And I still have bullet fragments in my head. I still have next to the arteries, so I can never have an MRI again. So that's always the neurologists that I've dealt with over the last few years. They're very concerned about that. I have trouble breathing. I have a denture plate. It's just been tough. It's hard, but I battle through it.
Trooper James Casey, thank you so much for coming on the show. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it also.
I'm Dan Abrams. Thanks for watching. Hi, everyone. I'm Dan Abrams, and this is Court Camp.
You ready to take your plea?
You've had 2 girlfriends that have gone missing, and the last person they were seen with is you?
First up, we're in Harrisonville, Missouri for the verdict in the trial of Kyler Yost. The 32-year-old is charged with 1 count of murder and 1 count of manslaughter in the deaths of his former girlfriends Kara Kopetsky and Jessica Runyons. Here's Kopetsky at age 17 in the hallway of her high school on the last day she was seen alive. She had recently filed a restraining order against Yost, who was 18 at the time. Though he initially was a suspect, he wasn't charged with any crime. Yost was also seen with the 21-year-old Runyons on the night she disappeared. The young women were killed nearly 10 years apart, but their bodies were discovered in the same field by a mushroom hunter. Police had limited physical evidence that connected Youst to the crimes, yet he was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. He pled not guilty. At trial, though, the state had one major advantage. Multiple witnesses who testified Youst had confessed to the crimes. One of his ex-girlfriends even wore a hidden camera while working with the FBI and captured audio of Youst discussing the victims.
Because I moved here and left out in the wilderness alone. What? Her spirits just roam the forest.
Youst claims he was merely bragging about killing the young women and was tired of having to prove his innocence. But that wouldn't be his only defense. In court, Youst tries to pin the killings on his half-brother, Jessup Carter, who committed suicide in jail a few years before the trial. There is no evidence to back Youst's claim that his brother was a serial killer. Now with Youst on the stand, prosecutor Julie Tolley has some questions about this new defense.
You want the jury to believe, as you sit here right now, that the man that is dead is the one that's responsible for this, Kyler?
I think that's why he killed himself.
Tolley continues to grill the defendant on why he waited so long to share this potentially explosive theory.
So you would rather sit in jail and be charged with 2 counts of murder in the first degree than to tell law enforcement that your brother allegedly was the one that did this?
I knew that I was getting blamed, and I knew that I'd have my chance to speak my piece right here on the stand.
With Youst on the ropes, Tolley goes for the knockout.
You must be the most unlucky guy in the world. You know why?
Why's that?
You've had 2 girlfriends that have gone missing, and the last person they were seen with is you? That's pretty unlucky, isn't it?
I mean, I think that's extremely unlucky, but anyone who has a brother that's a serial killer, I would say, is very unlucky.
And after the prosecution and defense finish their arguments, it's now up to the jury. They deliberate for 15 hours before returning with a verdict. Guilty. For the death of Kara Kopetsky, Youst was convicted of voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to 15 years in prison. For the killing of Jessica Runyons, he was convicted of murder in the 2nd degree and received 30 years, which is the maximum sentence in the state of Missouri. In total, Youst is sentenced to 45 years in a state penitentiary. Next, we're in Missoula, Montana, for the sentencing of Francis Crowley. The 33-year-old pled guilty to criminal endangerment, child criminal endangerment, and no contest to assault on a minor after he abandoned his 5-month-old nephew in a remote area of the Lolo National Forest. Crowley, who was camping in the area at the time, was high on methamphetamine and bath salts when he crashed his car on a remote mountain trail with the infant in the back seat. Crowley claimed that his nephew was too heavy to carry to safety, so he laid him face down on the ground, covered him with sticks, and walked away. After authorities received tips, a search effort was launched, and 9 hours later, the infant was found, still alive. Hungry, cold, and severely dehydrated, the child was rushed to the hospital, where this heart-wrenching photo was taken. Thankfully, the infant would make a full recovery. Now at sentencing, the sheriff's deputy, who miraculously found and rescued the child, recalls his thoughts as he was searching.
I can't believe somebody would do this to a kid, and I can't believe that we were looking for a baby.
The deputy also testifies that the defendant was able to provide little information about where he'd left his nephew.
Francis was less than helpful. He was more in a state of more intoxicated. He was higher than anybody I've ever dealt with in 10 years in law enforcement.
When given a chance to argue mitigating factors of the crime, the defense claimed Crowley didn't mean any harm to the child and that the drugs were to blame. But Judge Karen Townsend isn't buying.
I think that there was no harm to him by putting him face down on a mountain, buried in a bunch of sticks. That's no harm.
I don't think that he's injured.
And Judge Townsend's reaction says it all. Now, before learning his sentence, Crowley, who's appeared distraught throughout the hearing, speaks for himself.
This has completely changed my life. It doesn't matter what sentences that I get. I'm just all like, it's done. Like, I need help though. I'm gonna go to prison. What? Who am I? I'm a rat. How do you think I feel? Huh? That you're the one that found him when I'm the one that was supposed to be there for him. I have to tell my little nieces I almost killed their little brother.
Francis Crowley was then sentenced to 30 years in prison for the criminal child endangerment charge, with 10 of them suspended, bringing his total sentence to 20 years.
But I'm an adult male. I don't need to be insulted like that.
Next, we go to Maui, Hawaii, for the trial of Stephen Capabianco. He's charged with the murder of his pregnant ex-girlfriend, Carly Scott. Capabianco was the last person to see Scott alive the night she disappeared. And police believe Capabianco killed Carly because he didn't want to be a father. The victim's body was never located, but police did find Carly's burnt-out car and pieces of her clothing. Capabianco was charged with second-degree murder. He pled not guilty. But since the trial began, things have been tense between prosecutor Robert Rivera and defense attorney John Apo.
How can I not ask whether he's in cahoots with the prosecutor?
I object on the baseless accusation right now in front of the jury.
During cross-examination of Phaedra Weiss, the victim's sister, Rivera challenges Apo's entire line of questioning.
Narrative? You can ask the question, I guess. But
I'm talking to the court. The counsel's being ridiculous again.
So that it would be an appropriate time to take a lunch break.
Yeah, I'm going to object to counsel just calling me a dummy as he's walking by.
According to Apo, as Rivera's heading to the table, he calls him a dummy.
First of all, if it happened, I didn't hear it.
Ask him if it happened.
Wait.
You dummy.
Wait. Okay.
Let's bring the cameras in.
All right.
You dummy?
The judge sends the jury out for lunch, so he addressed the two attorneys.
It's not going to be tolerated. It will be dealt with.
Judge, I'm not denying I said that under my breath. I did on the way back to my counsel. I did say that. But I was not looking at Mr. Poe, looking at him at his face. But I did say that.
Apo finds the state's argument almost laughable, and the judge steps in.
You're both under a lot of pressure. That's no excuse, by the way. So I don't want any more displays similar to what just occurred in front of the jury. That applies to you as well, Mr. Poe.
If I just like, absolutely.
But Apo refuses to let it go.
You know, I'm just trying to do a job here. And I got somebody calling me a dummy?
Finally, Rivera puts an end to this feud.
You know, I'm still apologizing.
Apologizes to who? Me? Or the court?
Mr. Poe?
He's addressing me on it.
Mr. Poe?
I heard him apologize to somebody, and I was just wondering whether he was apologizing to you or me.
Why don't you guys both just settle down?
The attorneys head to their respective corners and refocus on Capabianco's trial, who, if found guilty, could go to prison for the rest of his life. After more than 6 months of testimony, both sides rest and leave it up to the jury, who return with a verdict.
They were cold, they were calculated, and self-centered. And for that, you must serve an extremely severe penalty.
Capabianco sentenced to a minimum of 50 years in prison, 40 for the death of Carly Scott, and 10 for arson. He's currently appealing the verdict. Next, we go to Newport, Kentucky for jury selection. The defendant, 34-year-old Mikkel Huggenberg, is charged with assault against a Campbell County deputy. Here's Huggenberg at the defense table. While the attorneys are at the bench speaking with the judge, Huggenberg gets up in the direction of the potential jury. Two deputies make their way over, preventing him from getting to the potential jurors. But the defendant is determined to break through.
What are you doing? You're under arrest. What are you doing? You are under arrest.
After Huggenberg slugs one deputy, a taser can be heard. The electric jolt came from a device attached to his ankle.
You are under arrest.
Despite the tasing, Huggenberg continues.
You are under arrest.
Of course, he's the one about to be placed into cuffs.
You cannot tell me what to do. I am not a prisoner. I am a free person.
You can take it back to the cell, and then I'll talk to the attorney.
Chris, the other arm. These people, somebody come back here and say to me, these people are under arrest.
Huggenberg continues to protest his treatment by deputies.
What are you doing to my arms? Nobody else.
Huggenberg's removed from the court and slapped with an additional assault charge. Huggenberg is found guilty and, combined with his original charge, is sentenced to a total of 12 years in prison.
What's it like to use a Sawzall to cut a woman's head off?
Next up, we're in Jacksonville, Florida, for the trial of Russell Tillis. The 59-year-old was charged with kidnapping, first-degree murder, and abuse of a corpse after the dismembered body of 30-year-old Joni Gunter was found buried on his property. Tillis, who was already in jail for allegedly assaulting two police officers when Gunter's remains were discovered, maintained his innocence. But using a confidential informant, investigators secretly recorded conversations with Tillis, including a grisly confession the prosecution focused on.
This man chillingly and amusingly describes how it's pretty easy to dispose of a body after killing it by using a Sawzall, a reciprocating saw, to dismember the remains of a human being and bury them in various locations.
Prosecutors allege Tillis had held Gunter, whose sister believed she'd become involved in prostitution, captive in his home and sold her to other men for sex before killing her. Despite his apparent jailhouse confession, Tillis pleaded not guilty, claiming the entire confession was fabricated and that he actually knew he was being recorded. So why admit to a murder he did not commit? Tillis claimed he was suicidal at the time and actually trying to get the death penalty in order to escape the potential 30-year prison sentence he was already facing in his other assault case.
That your plan is, I'm going to tell the world about the dismembered body in my yard, so multiple years from now, I might face the death penalty. That was your plan.
Yeah, it's called suicide by state.
Suicide by cop I've heard of, where a person would attack a police officer and kind of force that police officer to kill them.
It's certainly a branch off of suicide by state.
After recanting his confession, Tillis attempts to pin the murder on his brother, Claude Tillis, who he says showed up at his house with the body of Joni Gunter in the trunk of his car.
What did you see?
Well, she was in the trunk, and there was a mass amount of blood on her chest when she was dead.
When pressed for more information, after speaking in detail for more than 2 hours on the stand, Russell Tillis decides it's time to bite his tongue.
What did you do with her body to get Joni Gunter out of that trunk?
Well, at this point in the interrogation, I am going to claim the Fifth Amendment, and I'm not going to make any more statements regarding that question, and as a means to protect myself from any future associations. But you can continue to ask me questions, and I will not answer them.
And Prosecutor Mizrahi does have more questions. So, in front of the jury, he unleashes a question hailstorm.
Who buried her? What's it like to use a Sawzall to cut a woman's head off? Did the Sawzall blade wear out when you were cutting her shoulders? Did you have to use multiple blades? Hypothetically speaking, of course. How long did it take to chop up a human body?
I will concede to telling you, Mr. Zarahi, that I knew Miss Gunter was buried in that backyard. I knew the condition of the body, and I was present. But you can continue to ask me questions, and I will not answer them.
Despite his lack of answers, the jury had heard enough. Russell Tillis was later found guilty of kidnapping, first-degree murder, and abuse of a corpse in the death of Joan Gunter. He received 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole after the jury failed to reach a unanimous decision for the death penalty. Next, we're in Dayton, Ohio, for the sentencing of Harvey Lee Jones. The 34-year-old was found guilty of multiple crimes, including kidnapping, aggravated burglary, and 2 counts of aggravated murder. Jones had only been out of prison less than a year after serving time for previous charges of attempted rape and aggravated burglary, when he broke into his ex-girlfriend Carly Hewley's apartment and shot and killed her and her friend Demetrius Beckwith. And during trial, it was revealed that Carly Hewley's young son witnessed the deadly encounter.
That 10-year-old boy watched as the defendant yelled at his mom and Demetrius, and as his mom and Demetrius begged for their lives. He then watched as the defendant shot and killed his mom and Demetrius.
Now at sentencing, Carly Hewley's mother shares an emotional victim impact statement with the court.
When Carly was murdered, it left a huge hole in our hearts. She loved her family. She loved to cook. She loved her son.
Before learning his sentence, Jones is also given an opportunity to speak. But rather than addressing the heinous crimes, he turns around and faces Carly Hewley's mother to state his innocence.
That's not me at all. It's not me at all. You understand? I've been standing by my innocence since day one and will continue to stand by it. It's only right.
But before he can continue, Carly's mother stops him in his tracks.
Let me just tell you this.
Following a court recess, Harvey Lee Jones was issued 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole for the murders of Carly Hewley and Demetrius Beckwith. That's it for this edition of Court Cam. I'm Dan Abrams. Thanks for watching.